All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. When we usually learn about the British in India, we tend to picture this grand, traditional military conquest, right? Well, actually, scratch that. The reality is way more modern and honestly a lot more chilling. This wasn't your typical clash of empires. What we're actually looking at is literally the world's most devastating hostile corporate takeover. Today, we're going to break down exactly how a single, profit-driven multinational corporation, the East India Company, managed to just swallow an entire sovereign state whole, replacing a real government with absolute unfiltered corporate rule.
To put things into perspective, back in the 1600s, India accounted for a staggering 25% of the entire global GDP. 25%. People called it the golden bird for good reason. We're not just talking about a prosperous place here. This region was an absolute economic titan. It was basically the main engine running global commerce at the time. All this massive wealth, it was mostly driven by insanely rich agriculture and a massive textile industry, churning out silk and muslin that everyone wanted, from Europe all the way to East Asia. It was, quite literally, the center of the economic world. The contrast back then was just stark. On one side, you've got a super wealthy India, practically the world's trading hub, soaking up something like 18 to 20 tons of global gold and silver every single year. And that was just to balance out its massive exports. European merchants were desperately throwing precious metals at the subcontinent because, frankly, they didn't really have anything else of value to trade. Then on the flip side, you have 17th century England. It was a relatively poor, agrarian state just kind of dipping its toes into global waters. The gap in wealth and global influence was absolutely monumental. So that brings us to Section 1, a tale of two economies. Let's see how those scales actually tipped. To really understand how those scales tipped, we have to look at the ultimate prize, and that was Bengal. Bengal wasn't just your average province. Its economy was an absolute powerhouse. It drew in merchants from all over the globe like a giant magnet. Its capital, Murshidabad, wasn't just some local town. It was the central commercial hub for all of Asia. Whether we're talking high-yield agriculture, opium, cotton, or superfine silk, Bengal was just churning it out at an astonishing scale, and Europe was desperately buying it up. Basically, controlling Bengal meant controlling the very arteries of global commerce. Now, in totally stark contrast, the British East India Company started out as, well, desperate opportunists. They were essentially a scrappy startup with a severe lack of cash. In the early days, their business model looked a lot more like piracy, literally looting Dutch and Portuguese ships just to stay afloat. Get this, here's a crazy piece of history. When the British royal family was handed the island of Bombay in 1661 as a dowry for marrying a Portuguese princess, the British literally had no idea where Bombay was on a map. They spent years just trying to figure out the geography of their own dowry. So yeah, these guys were definitely not sophisticated conquerors right out of the gate. Moving right along to Section 2, the uncrowned kings. This is where we meet the Jagat Seths. Okay, so the Jagat Seths operated pretty much like the corrupt venture capitalists of their era. They started as Marwari Jain merchants, but this single banking family completely monopolized the entire regional economy. They were acting as the de facto central bank. They controlled the state mint, literally deciding the value of the currency itself. They were lending out money at jaw-dropping 10 to 12% interest rates, which effectively trapped everybody, local landlords, even European trading companies like the East India Company, in high-interest debt. And perhaps most importantly, they were absolute kingmakers. They openly financed and installed rulers who would guarantee protection for their corporate monopolies. By financing puppet rulers like Murshid Quli Khan and later Alivardi Khan, this one family amassed totally unchecked power. They figured out pretty quickly that real control doesn't actually come from sitting on the throne. It comes from owning the debt of the guy who does. They essentially held the local government and those desperate European traders entirely by their financial strings. So behind the scenes, they were the true uncrowned kings of Bengal, just pulling the levers of state power purely to generate massive monopolistic wealth for themselves. Which brings us to Section 3, the corporate hostile takeover. This is the story of Siraj Uddaulla's fall. The whole takeover really kicks off when a young, new CEO of the state, Nawab Siraj Uddaula, comes into power. He immediately sees the massive threat the Jagat Seths pose to his sovereignty, and he makes a really fatal mistake. He goes after them directly. He demands tax audits. He demands a whopping 3 crore rupees from them to fund his own military campaigns. And, if historical sources are to be believed, he completely humiliates them in public, even threatening to physically slap or whip the head of the banking family, Mahtab Chand. Threatening their bottom line was one thing, but physically insulting them? That was the exact trigger that set the greatest corporate betrayal of all time into motion. This whole sequence of events reveals how a personal insult rapidly spiraled into a full-blown corporate buyout. First, Siraj attacks the British in Calcutta in 1756, which leads to the infamous Black Hole tragedy. In a rapid countermove, the East India Company sends in Robert Clive. Now, let's be clear, Clive wasn't exactly a master statesman. Sources describe him more as a glorified thug or a corporate enforcer, but he did have a highly disciplined military force. The Jagasets see this and spot an immediate opportunity. They actually partner with the company. They bankroll Clive's military muscle to completely overthrow Siraj and install their own compliant puppet ruler, Mir Jafar, at the Battle of Plassey in 1757.
4 crore rupees. That staggering number is the exact bribe the Jagat-Seths and their syndicate promised Mir Jafar to betray the Nawab right there on the battlefield. I mean, think about what this actually means for a second. The Battle of Plassey wasn't a traditional military victory at all. It was a transaction. It was a hostile takeover, completely funded by local billionaires who bought out the military leadership just to finalize the corporate acquisition of Bengal.
And that leads us right into Section 4, the Great Wealth Drain. How a nation was bled dry. So, with their puppet CEO installed, the real extraction could finally begin. The ultimate power grab happens in 1765, when Lord Clive secures the Diwani, which is basically the legal right to collect revenues directly from the people of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. Just like that, literally overnight, the East India Company morphed from being a bunch of foreign merchants into ruthless, purely profit-driven tax collectors. This kicked off what historians call the drain of wealth. Local taxes squeezed from Indian farmers were then turned around and used by the company to buy Indian goods, effectively bleeding the region's capital totally dry and shipping all that wealth straight back to London. The human cost of all this corporate greed was just absolute devastation. In 1770, a massive famine struck the region. But instead of stepping up and providing relief, the company's revenue collectors brutally enforced 100% tax collection. Why? Well, they had to maintain their profit margins for the shareholders back in England, of course. While crops totally failed, the company mercilessly squeezed every single drop of revenue from a dying populace. An estimated 1.2 crore people, that is literally 1/3 of Bengal's entire population, starved to death. It absolutely stands as one of history's darkest, most horrifying examples of corporate profit overriding human life. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the ultimate price of greed, the fall of the Seths. Now, you're probably wondering, what on earth happened to those corrupt local billionaires who funded this whole disaster? Did the Jagat-Seths actually get to sit back and enjoy the monopoly they paid 4 crore rupees to protect? Well, as it turns out, history has a pretty brutal sense of irony. The very puppet rulers they helped put in power eventually turned right against them. Finding his authority totally undermined by the East India Company's insatiable greed, the new Nawab, Mir Qasim, grew absolutely furious. In 1763, he arrested the heads of the Jagat-Seth family. In a really grisly end, he had them dragged to the Munger fort and literally thrown off the top, straight into the Ganges River. And in the ultimate twist of fate, the East India Company didn't lift a single finger to save them. Not one. Instead, the company just casually absorbed the Seths' entire banking empire. By the time guys like Warren Hastings and Lord Cornwallis came around, the East India Company had taken total institutional control of the economy. They completely replaced the old syndicate with their own permanent corporate and colonial rule. Those local elites who sold out their own sovereignty for a quick short-term profit, they lost absolutely everything. You know, this explainer really isn't just some dusty history lesson about the 18th century. It serves as a terrifyingly real blueprint of what happens when a profit-driven entity becomes way more powerful than the state itself. When we look around today at the immense, borderless power of modern multinational corporations, some of which have revenues that absolutely dwarf the GDPs of entire nations, we really have to ask ourselves, are we actually paying attention to the warnings of the East India Company? When corporate profit completely replaces national sovereignty, who really pays the ultimate price? Thanks for exploring this one with me, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.